From fathersofthechurch.com, Mike Aquilina back with us here on the Sunrise Morning Show. Good morning, Mike.
Morning, Annie.
So, Mike, every year on the liturgical calendar, we celebrate the back-to-back feast days of St. Monica on the 27th and her son, St. Augustine, on the 28th. You know, I think it's kind of similar to the way that the church places the Feast of the Immaculate Heart right after the Feast of the Sacred Heart. But unlike Jesus and Mary, the hearts of Monica and Augustine were not always, shall we say, so united, were they?
No. Augustine was a very gifted child. Surely he got a lot of those gifts from his mother. He inherited them from her, and he could attribute them to the way she raised him. But he was also a very independent child and just a normally rebellious child. You know, he got into mischief when he was a teenager, because lots of boys get into mischief when they're teenagers and they get over it. But he continued his rebellion into his college years, as some boys do. The mischief became more serious. You know, he got his girlfriend pregnant out of wedlock, and he started to dabble in these exotic religions from other places, he really put behind him a lot of what Monica had taught him. This just broke her heart. You know, there's no other way to talk about it. She was heartbroken at the thought of her son committing mortal sins and not practicing the faith.
And I think many know that their relationship, we know all about it because it is recounted by Augustine himself in his Confessions, of course, which has been a perpetual bestseller ever since its publication, I believe. And actually, before we even get to the story here, a first of its kind sort of book, right?
Yeah, yes, it's considered the first biography, and he talks about his mother there and really sketches a beautiful portrait of her throughout the book, because she was the important person in his life, and he says that openly.
Yeah.
Some people would be embarrassed to say, it's my mom. My mom is the one who, the reason I'm here. She was his teacher, he said, and he was her disciple. Now he's a philosopher. He's a rhetorician, and he's saying that he's the disciple of a simple woman from Africa, a woman who may not have been able to read. And yet, here, one of the greatest thinkers in human history considers himself to be her student.
Well, you know, Monica is so interesting. So we think about all of the years that she prayed for her son. And
17.
Unbelievable. And who is it that comes along in Augustine's life but St. Ambrose of Milan, who is the one that really opens Augustine's eyes to the faith, at least in the moment. Of course, in hindsight, he can look back on his mother in this way. But how did Monica herself come to be friends with St. Ambrose? I mean, that's a relationship that must have been truly interesting as well.
Well, this speaks to one of the hidden values of the Catholic Church. It's a society. And so when you go anywhere in the world and you walk into the Catholic Church, you're walking into a community, you're walking into a family. Funny thing is, Monica had tried to go with her son when he moved to Italy, and he tricked her. He installed her in a chapel and said, "Why don't you wait here and pray, and I'll come and get you when the ship arrives." Well, the ship arrived. He didn't go to get her,
Wow.
and he went to Italy while she was praying in the chapel. You know, what a creep.
Yeah,
To treat his mother
seriously.
that way. So Augustine goes off, and he's living in Rome, right? Eventually, he moves from Rome to get a job in Milan, and then his mother is trying to catch up with him. And so she crosses the sea finally by herself on a boat. The voyages were very dangerous at that time. You know, there were dangers from storms, dangers from pirates, and dangers from illness on the boat. You know, the food preservation wasn't the best in the 4th century, but she went after him because she was going to be by his side, and she was going to exercise all the influence she could on her son to get him back into the practice of the faith. So she went there to Rome. She has to figure out where he is because he's not there. And so she must have asked around. Now, where would she begin to ask around? She would begin to ask around in the church. Maybe she would ask where there are African priests in the city of Rome, because she and Augustine were Africans. And she would go to the Africans because they would be the society in which he moved about. So eventually she found out about his appointment in Milan. He was appointed to the imperial court in Milan, the chair of Latin rhetoric, and she found her way there. So it's pretty cool what the church puts at our disposal, and we don't even appreciate these things. It's a society, it's a family, it's a support network.
Yeah, and so, we started off by talking about how their hearts were not so united, but then at the end of the story, I mean, what a beautiful union of two hearts.
Augustine gets to Milan, and he encounters Ambrose, and Ambrose was a very accomplished man. Augustine was accomplished too, and he was full of himself. If there was one person in the world who could go one for one with Augustine, it would be Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose had been governor of the province, and then he was bishop of the city, and he was a man who came from a distinguished lineage. He had all of this going for him. Augustine was willing to listen to him. He was also a good preacher, and Augustine heard in his preaching the solution to so many of the problems that he had had with the Old Testament, reading the Old Testament, making sense of the Old Testament. And Ambrose gave him a way to understand the Old Testament. And soon, that began to soften his heart. And certainly it must have softened his heart toward his mother as well. He began to appreciate her persistence, her perseverance in prayer. So, all of these things began to come together for him. It's a beautiful story as he tells it in his confessions. He tells elements of it elsewhere. He buys a little cottage out by a lake, and he and his friends kind of take up residence there, and his son as well. So Monica goes, and she's kind of den mother for all these young men who are sitting around having philosophical conversations all day, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful scene as he presents it in one of his dialogues, two of his dialogues actually. And this is the place where he talks about her as his teacher, as his master. And it's funny because they're always sitting outside philosophizing. Monica is always trying to get the boys inside so that they could eat a hearty meal. Many scholars have looked at this and said she kind of represents the church. All of these people are outside the church. Monica's trying to get them inside so they could sit down and have the meal that Christ intends for them.